Hey guys, and welcome to CIRS Decoded. I am so glad that you're here today because this episode is one that I really wish more people with CIRS could hear at the very beginning of their journey. If you've been feeling like your brain is not working, like your emotions are harder to manage, like your memory is slipping, or like your motivation has disappeared, or even that you simply just don't feel like yourself anymore, I want you to hear this right from the beginning. You are not imagining this, you are not crazy, you are not lazy. You're not failing at healing because you are weak or you don't want to do this. What you're experiencing is often a very real part of chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. And today we're going to talk about why CIRS so often seems to affect the brain first, or at least more intensely than other areas of the body, and then why understanding that can completely change how you not only see yourself, but how you see your recovery. So, one of the most painful parts of living with CIRS is that many people expect to feel physically ill, but they're not prepared for how deeply it can affect their thinking, their mood, their focus, their patience, their confidence, or even their personality. And I've had people say things to me like, I used to be sharp and driven and just social, and now I can barely remember what I was saying mid-sentence. They'll also tell me things like, I cry more easily now. I get overwhelmed more easily. I can't handle stress the way that I used to. And sometimes even that I don't recognize myself anymore. And because so much of conventional medicine is still not fully equipped to understand CIRS, many patients get told that it's anxiety, it's depression, burnout, stress, or just trauma alone. And I want to be very careful here, though, because those things they absolutely do matter in this case, and they often overlap with the chronic illness. But in CIRS, there's something deeper happening too. There's a biological storm affecting the brain. And until we understand that brain component, we will keep blaming people for symptoms that are actually rooted in physiology. So this is where I want to introduce something that it's central. I created this and it's central to the way that I teach and also the way that I coach people. And that's called the B3 model of care. So B3 stands for biology, brain, and behavior. And the reason that I really love this framework so much for CIRS is because it gives us a way to explain what patients are experiencing that is both scientific and also compassionate and understanding. It helps us move away from shame and actually into understanding the person. And the biology piece, so out of the biology, brain, behavior, that biology piece is actually asking what is happening in the body, what inflammatory, immune, hormonal, toxic, mitochondrial, physiological processes are being driven and are actually driving the symptoms. And then the brain piece will ask, how is that biology affecting things like cognition, mood, motivation, nervous system regulation, sensory processing, or emotional control? And then the behavior piece, this piece actually asks us, how does all of that show up in daily life? How does it affect things like follow through, routines, relationships, decision making, recovery habits, and the ability to stay engaged in treatment, especially in treatment like the Shoemaker protocol, which is really difficult for some people to follow. So when we look at CIRS through this lens, so much of this illness starts to finally make sense. So let's start off. Let's talk about the biology piece. So CIRS is a chronic dysregulated inflammatory response that occurs in genetically susceptible individuals after exposure to biotoxins or other triggering exposures. So often people think about mold first, and mold is a major component or a trigger. In usually over 80% of cases of CIRS, it's triggered by mold. But it's important to understand there are other triggers. So this conversation is actually, like I said, it's more broad than just mold alone. So it includes the immune and inflammatory chaos that happens when the body doesn't successfully clear certain toxins, and instead it stays stuck in a prolonged state of activation. So this is not a simple allergic reaction. Some people misdiagnose this with like a mold allergy. This is not. This is a genetic disorder. So it's very different than just an allergy. And it's not just a mild irritation. We know that mold irritates pretty much any body, but CIRS is different. This is what happens after that initial trigger. This is the genetic component when that gene turns on, what actually happens in the body, inside the body. So part of what happens with this is your immune system, it keeps responding. The inflammatory messengers remain elevated. Detoxification and signaling systems get really disrupted in these people. And then multiple organ systems, they begin to feel the effects. So this is why people with CIRS can develop symptoms across so many body systems at once. And this is also what makes it so hard to diagnose and why they get gaslit by doctors all the time. So their fatigue does not exist alone. Their headaches do not exist in isolation, and the gut issues do not exist in isolation. The dizziness, the sleep disruption, the sensitivity, the anxiety, mood changes, and the brain fog are all part of a larger network. So now here's the part that so many people, medical professionals, miss. The brain is not outside of this network. The brain is one of the organs most affected by the inflammatory burden, and usually within 12 hours of exposure, the mycotoxins that were inhaled have now crossed the blood-brain barrier. The one thing that is supposed to protect our brains cannot stop this assault from happening. So when the immune system is activated chronically, the brain pays attention to this as well. And inflammatory signaling can alter the neurotransmitter balance, your energy production, your blood flow, your sleep regulation, your stress response, and the way the nervous system interprets safety and danger. So the brain's incredibly metabolically active, which means it's especially vulnerable when the body's inflamed or under energized, sleep deprived, toxic, or stuck in this state of alarm that CIRS seems to cause with everybody. So when someone with CIRS says, my body hurts, but honestly, my brain symptoms are the worst part, that makes perfect sense. In many cases, the brain is not a side issue. It's one of the main stages on which this illness plays out. So this is why I often say that one of the first things CIRS steals is a person's mental clarity. It can steal your word recall. It can steal your memory, your emotional steadiness. It can steal your confidence. It can make a simple decision feel extremely exhausting. It can make basic household chores feel like advanced calculus, like something that you just cannot attain, you can't do. And it can make conversations harder to follow. So this is important too, because this is where the isolation starts. This is where people start to withdraw from social contact. So it can make your social interactions feel overstimulating. It can make noise louder, light harsher. It can make stress feel almost unbearable. And for someone who has never experienced this before, it can be terrifying. They start wondering if they have things like early dementia, severe psychiatric illness, because a lot of people will be told that they'll go through tests and everything and then told, okay, your labs look great, you're fine, when they feel like they're dying. So this can also lead people to believe that they have a psychiatric illness, and they'll seek out psychiatric care who will then medicate for that instead of looking for this important root cause. So it's really important for you guys to understand, how this can show up for you. So other things that I've had people tell me that, they were afraid of, they thought that they had like a brain tumor or some type of, permanent brain damage from something. And they often begin to panic, not only because the symptoms themselves are scary, but because of what those symptoms seem to mean. And then that fear is understandable, because what I want to do in this episode is to give people a more grounded explanation so that that fear starts to come down and people can begin to heal. So let's talk about when inflammation is high. So when your inflammation is high, your body is under a chronic threat. So the brain shifts priorities. It becomes less interested in optimization or being healthy, and it becomes more interested in survival. So that means things like executive function start to go down. You're planning, you're organizing, you're initiating a task, prioritizing tasks, and your follow through can all become harder. And unfortunately, these are, the exact things that you need to be able to heal and follow a protocol. So other things affected are your working memory can become a lot weaker. Your attention can become fragile. You're not able to pay attention. And then your emotional tolerance. So the way that you perceive emotions and can handle them can start to come down as well. So the brain becomes less flexible and more reactive to situations. So that doesn't mean that the person is choosing to be difficult or unmotivated. It means the system is strained. If you think about the brain like the control center of a house, okay, CIRS is like a wildfire outside, and there's a power shortage inside, and multiple alarm systems are going off at once. So, of course, the control center is not going to be operating smoothly. And that is not a character flaw for somebody. That's a system under siege. So, this brings us to the second part of the B3 model of care, which is the brain. And for me, this part is the most important. And it is the one piece that is always missed. I've seen excellent care out there. I've seen people connect biology and behavior, but the brain is important because the brain is your processor. So let's talk about what this means in this model of care. So in CIRS, the brain is not just tired, it's often inflamed, it's overstimulated, it's underfueled, it's forced into a persistent threat-oriented mode. So that can look like brain fog, but brain fog is really just the surface label. Underneath brain fog, it may be slowed processing speed, difficulty finding words, forgetfulness, reduced working memory, trouble learning new information, increased distractibility, emotional volatility, hypervigilance, low frustration tolerance, decreased motivation, and sensory overload. That's a lot of important things. And when you think about that, all of those track as behaviors. So once again, people will tell their doctor about this, and typically they will be sent to a psychiatrist for an evaluation because these are what are typically seen in like as behaviors. So they need behavioral health modifications, but no one looks for the underlying cause, which is CIRS and the inflammation that's going on in the body. So some people might feel completely flat and numb, like they just have no emotions, while others feel anxious and edgy all the time. Some people will swing between both of these, but many have a nervous system that feels like it just can't settle down. And they are tired but wired. They're exhausted but unable to truly rest. They know they need healing, but they cannot seem to get their brain on board consistently enough to do what the healing requires. And this is where so many people begin blaming themselves. They say, why can't I just get it together? Why can't I stick to anything? And what I want people to hear is this: behavior always makes sense in context. So if biology is dysregulated and the brain is under inflammatory and neurological stress, behavior is going to change. That's not surprising. It's really expected. This is the third part of the B3 model of care, and that's behavior. Behavior is what we see on the outside, but it is often the downstream expression of the deeper internal processes. So let's talk about what that looks like. So a person with CIRS may start withdrawing socially, not because they don't care about people, but because their social interaction has become cognitively and emotionally expensive. They start missing appointments, not because they are irresponsible, but because their memory, their planning, and their stamina are all impaired. They may procrastinate on treatment tasks because even opening one more portal message, as easy as that sounds, reading an email or one more lab interpretation, it feels neurologically overwhelming. They may become more irritable because their nervous system's overloaded and their margins are thin. They may seem inconsistent, but inconsistency is often what happens when capacity changes hour by hour. They may look unmotivated, but motivation is extremely difficult to sustain when inflammation, sleep disruption, energy failure, fear, and executive dysfunction are all competing at once. So, in other words, the behavior is not random, it's actually information and it's data for people like myself. So, one of the biggest mistakes that we make in chronic illness care is focusing only on behavior without asking what is driving it. We say things like you need to be more disciplined, or you just need to think positive, or you need to try harder to stick to the protocol. But if we do not address the biology and the brain, we're asking someone to build a house on a cracked foundation. And this is exactly why I believe people with CIRS need not only good medical care, but also a good CIRS literate and Shoemaker literate health coach like myself, who understands the actual day-to-day implementation. So a doctor may identify the diagnosis and guide the treatment with the medications, and that is extremely important. But what happens between the visits? Who helps that person translate treatment into lived life? Who helps them structure their environment, simplify their decisions, reduce the overwhelm, support routines, interpret setbacks, or adapt when the brain is not cooperating? That's where coaching becomes essential. So I want to say something here that may be deeply validating for some of you out there. If you've been struggling to follow through with recovery tasks, that does not automatically mean that you are non-compliant. Sometimes what people call non-compliance is actually neuroinflammation. It's cognitive overload, fear, sleep deprivation, perfectionism, trauma activation, depleted energy, or even survival behavior. Sometimes it's not that the patient will not heal, it is that the patient needs more support to do what healing is asking of them. So this is why a one-size-fits-all plan often fails. People do not need more instructions. They need scaffolding. They need translation. They need repetition. They need emotional safety. They need someone who understands both the protocol and the psychology of living with a dysregulated brain and body. So another important part of this conversation is the emotional impact of feeling mentally different. This is huge. Like I said earlier, because a lot of people will feel these things and go see a psychiatrist who doesn't understand to look at the biology and the brain as well. So when CIRS affects the brain, people often start grieving quietly. They grieve the version of themselves who used to read quickly, who used to multitask easily, tolerate stress, remember everything, work full days, enjoy spontaneity, and even trust their own mind. And this grief is important and it matters. It's not something superficial. Cognitive changes can feel like an identity injury. And when that injury is not understood by others, it becomes even heavier for the person who's carrying that burden. Many CIRS patients are high capacity people. They're intelligent, they're driven, they're conscientious, and they're used to functioning at a high level. So when their brain starts failing them, they do not just feel sick. They feel ashamed. They feel scared. They feel like they are actually disappearing. And I think we have to talk about that more openly, because shame is one of the hidden burdens of this illness, and it is so rarely talked about. So this is also why motivation-based messages can actually backfire if they're not grounded in physiology. Telling someone to just push through, just push through it when their brain's inflamed, it often makes them feel worse, not better. And what helps more is just understanding. What helps more is framework that says your biology is under strain, your brain is adapting to that strain, and your behavior is reflecting that strain. And because of that, healing has to be designed in a way that works with your current capacity and not against it. That means breaking things down. That means simplifying steps. That means reducing cognitive load. That means creating external structure when internal structure is weak. And that means making treatment more doable and not just more theoretically correct. So, what does healing look like through the B3 model of care? Well, first, we support biology, and that means reducing your exposure where possible, addressing your inflammation, improving sleep, nourishing the body, stabilizing the blood sugar, supporting the gut, working through the appropriate treatment steps, of the shoemaker protocol with a doctor, and giving the system what it needs to begin to calm down. Again, this is not about pretending that one supplement or one strategy fixes everything. It's about recognizing that the body needs a lower inflammatory burden if the brain's going to recover effectively. And then second, we support the brain. That means understanding that the brain needs consistency, it needs safety, it needs rest, repetition, and reduced overload. It means not shaming cognitive symptoms. It means honoring that the nervous system may need active regulation. It means addressing sleep, stress sensory burden, and fear. It means creating an environment that helps the brain heal rather than constantly pushing it back into alarm. And then third, we support behavior. That means building routines that are actually realistic, using visual reminders, reducing decision fatigue, tracking symptoms, tracking wins, setting smaller goals, and then expecting healing to look more like a gradual rebuilding than a dramatic overnight transformation. So one thing I really want listeners to take away from this episode is that healing is not only about fixing labs or checking boxes off the protocol. Healing is about restoring function. It's about helping a person think more clearly, trust themselves again, manage life, more easily, show up more consistently, reconnect with people, and rebuild their own agency. This is why I care so much about integrating education with motivation. People with CIRS do not just need data. They need hope that makes sense. They need to know not only what is happening, but why it is happening, and then what they can do next. So let me give you a practical takeaway. If you have CIRS and you have been judging yourself harshly for how your brain has been functioning, I want you to pause and reframe that today. Instead of asking what is wrong with me, I want you to ask, what is happening in my biology that may be affecting my brain, and how is that shaping my behavior right now? That question alone can reduce shame and increase strategy. It moves you from moral judgment to clinical curiosity. And that shift matters because people heal better when they understand themselves better. Now, a second takeaway from today is to start observing your own B3 patterns. Notice the biology signals. When do your symptoms flare physically? Notice the brain signals. When are you more foggy, anxious, reactive, forgetful, or shut down? Notice the behavior signals. When do you avoid tasks, cancel plans, isolate, overthink, procrastinate, or emotionally crash? The goal is not to criticize yourself. The goal is to see the pattern, because once you can see the pattern, you can intervene more effectively. You can stop calling yourself lazy when you are actually overloaded. You can stop interpreting every bad day as a failure, and you can begin responding to your system more intelligently and compassionately. And a third takeaway from today is do not underestimate the value of support. If you have a shoemaker doctor, that's wonderful. That actually, you're lucky if you're one of the ones who has been able to find one. But even then, you may still need a CIRS literate health coach who can help you with the daily reality of recovery. And if you do not have a doctor, support may be even more important, not because a coach replaces a physician, because we do not, but because a coach helps you navigate the terrain between information and implementation. We can help you pace, organize, simplify, track, reflect, and adapt in a condition where the brain itself is often affected Having someone help you hold the map can make all the difference. So, guys, as I close today, I want to speak directly to the person who feels like they have been lost inside this illness. The person who used to feel sharp and capable and steady and now feels foggy, fragile, reactive, and unlike themselves. I want you to hear me. Okay, guys, and I get you. I have CIRS. I've been living with this for over a decade, so I feel it. But I want you to understand your symptoms are meaningful. Your suffering is real. Your brain changes do not mean you're failing. They mean your system needs support. And support is not a weakness, it is a strategy. If CIRS affects biology, brain, and behavior, then healing must also happen through biology, brain, and behavior. This is not a failure of willpower either. This is a smarter model of recovery. All right, guys, so thank you for being with me for this episode of CIRS Decoded. My hope is that today gave you some language for what you've been living through and a little more compassion for yourself in the process. In future episodes, we're going to keep breaking this down piece by piece, from things like the Shoemaker protocol to what to do if you cannot find a doctor, the gut brain health, some mental health, motivation, inflammation, nervous system repair, and then daily patterns that make healing either harder or more possible. But for today, I want you to remember this. You are not crazy, you are not lazy, and you are not broken. Your biology is affecting your brain is affecting your behavior. And when you understand that, you can finally begin to heal in a way that makes sense. All right, guys, I'll see you next time.